Hello and greetings, everyone. Welcome to the webinar channel of the Association of Certified eDiscovery Specialists. My name is Mike Quadraro. I am the president of ACEDS. Today, we are joined by our partner eDiscovery today, the fabulous Doug Austin, for a webinar entitled Beyond Cleanup, Turning Defensible Data into AI-Ready Insights. He's got some experts that are going to talk on this topic. Before we go any further, if you are not, you can subscribe to eDiscovery Today by visiting eDiscoverytoday.com. Please do that. In the meantime, we love questions. The panel and Doug are happy to take questions, so submit your questions and we'll get to them as we can. You have the option to submit your questions anonymously if you use the Q&A button on your screen. Also, if you'd like a copy of today's slide deck, it should be available in the resource widget. Okay, without further delay, super excited to bring on Doug Austin. Doug, please take it away.
Thanks, Mike. Hi, everybody, and welcome, as Mike said, to the ACEDS webinar on Beyond Cleanup, Turning Defensible Data into AI-Ready Insights. Over the next hour, in the second part of a two-part webinar series, we'll explore the next frontier of turning that defensible, well-managed data into a launchpad for AI-driven insights. We'll also break down how organizations can responsibly accelerate AI adoption through strong data governance, real-world use cases, and lessons from the field. Before we begin, as Mike noted, please note we do welcome questions, which you can submit at the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. And of course, as he also mentioned, the copy of the slides is available as well via the resources tab there as well. We've got a terrific panel here today to discuss these topics, so let me introduce them. Adam Rouse is the Director and Senior Counsel, eDiscovery Operations for Walgreens Company. Adam advises internal and external counsel concerning eDiscovery and legal hold issues across a wide variety of commercial, regulatory, and employment matters. Additionally, Adam coordinates with the global compliance team to facilitate data collection and analysis for global compliance efforts and drives the adoption of new and emerging legal technology within the legal department. Adam also teaches eDiscovery and advanced problem solving as adjunct faculty at Loyola University Chicago Law School. Welcome, Adam. Brendan Sullivan is the CEO at S2 Data. Brendan has an extensive history in data storage and retrieval spanning over 30 years and has been leading companies in the space for over 20 years. He often speaks on topics related to legacy data remediation, defensible deletion, the use of backup tape in eDiscovery, and retirement of legacy backup environments. His current focus at S2 Data is on helping clients reduce risk and exposure resulting from their backup environments, speeding up time to data, and lowering total cost of ownership for all data. Hello, Brendan.
Oh.
And Dera Nevin is the Managing Director, Digital Insights and Risk Management at FTI Consulting. She's a data lawyer and expert with more than 20 years of experience addressing digital risk issues, including privacy, data protection, information risk management, eDiscovery, and the application of emerging technologies to the delivery of legal services. Dera specializes in applying artificial intelligence, automation, and synthetic data strategies to complex client challenges. Hi, Dera. And I'm Doug Austin, who will be your Defensible Data and AI Insights point guard for this webinar. I'm the editor of eDiscovery Today, which is a daily blog about eDiscovery, cybersecurity, data privacy, information governance, and AI trends, best practices, and case law. I've been providing consulting and project management services in the legal space for over 30 years, so I know a thing or two because I've seen a thing or two, and I've been daily blogging for nearly 15 years, so I'm either committed or I ought to be. Here's what we'll be talking about today. We'll begin by briefly recapping the case study we discussed in part one for those of you who missed it, and we'll share a link to it if you want to check out the full webinar in part one. Then we'll discuss understanding AI, which tends to be misunderstood, and the different types of AI. We'll then start tying the two webinars together by discussing the role of data in the application of AI, and we'll spend some time discussing some real-world applications of AI, including a couple that you're probably not aware of. And we'll conclude by discussing considerations and caveats for bringing AI into the mix. We'll look to save time for questions at the end, but we'll address them along the way as well if we can. Of course, any ideas expressed by us here today are our own, not those of our organizations, clients, or partners. No AI algorithms were harmed in the making of this disclaimer. So let's start our discussion by briefly recapping the case study that we discussed in the last webinar. If you want to think of this webinar as a sequel to the last one, much like every Rocky sequel seemed to start with the end of the fight from the last movie, it'll help to provide context to this discussion. I should note that a write-up of the case study is in the link at the bottom of the left of the slide, and the link to the video for the first webinar is at the bottom right of the slide for you to check out those resources on your own. So Brendan, as we discussed in the first webinar, S2 Data and FTI Consulting recently worked on a large legacy email data restoration and remediation project for a client. Could you briefly provide the background of the project, what the client wanted to accomplish, and what were the deadlines that were driving project completion?
Sure. So at its core definition, it was a fairly classic proactive data remediation project, not dissimilar to any legacy data remediation project that we've undertaken. What made it complex and difficult was the size of it. Very, very many petabytes of data. Data residing across 3 continents, Asia, Europe, and the US, well in excess of 90,000 mailboxes to target across 3 things. 3 different service providers that hosted the data for client, which meant that they had their own rules of access, their own levels of how they managed it, and how they tuned it, and how they kept it separate, etc. So that made it a challenge. And then, of course, in 3 different countries, 3 different data privacy regulation requirements, so to speak. So, what might be good for one might not be good for somebody else, which ultimately meant that the work had to be done at different locations. So, but in terms of this project, it was list to keep, list to discard. That was all. That was the original ultimate requirement. These are the ones to keep, these are the ones not to. But what added to it is the changing factors, as is always the case in large remediation project like this. What looks like a situation on day 1 is not the same situation on day 30. There's a combination of long-term retention data, active matters that can change, and then potential matters that can come in. And so it had to be done in with all of those things hanging over us, and we managed between FTI, outside counsel, client themselves, and ourselves. And of course, that's the challenge of making these happen. In terms of the timelines, we had a long time to get this thing done, if I remember. And speed and defensibility are the key criteria. And to use a kind of analogy, legacy data remediation projects, they're like the walking dead. So the data itself, is they don't actually play an active part in current life. But if you get bit by one, you've got to start from scratch, and everything to hell. So that was challenges. So whenever you take on projects like this, and this was no different, then the faster you can get it done within the scope provided, the less risk, the less damage, the defensibility, and the lower costs, and the challenges.
Yeah, definitely. I love the Walking Dead analogy. That's a great one. I'm going to have to remember that one. And, I think you've already kind of hit on some of this, but if we can drill down maybe a little more into some of the key challenges. Obviously, if the project were easy, we wouldn't be writing about it in a case study or talking about it in 2 webinars. But could you get into a little more of some of the key challenges that we're seeing on this slide, and also get a little more into the 4-stage approach the team used to overcome those challenges?
Sure. The script environment was a data domain. Dell EMC has been around a while. Not everybody wants to continue support of these environments, and that was the case here. in that when the data is created, that was the backup platform of choice. And then third-party service providers end up managing those platforms. But in this case, not only was it unsupported in all 3 locations, it was not operational. And you leave them unplugged and power off for long enough, and the CMOS battery backups die, and they won't even power on. So initially we had to get them to a working state, and of course those parts are cheap, so we ended up rebuilding the storage elements work by buying stuff on eBay. I think largely equipment, rebuilding the CMOS battery backups and getting the operation. So we had an actual equipment challenge there, where we had to rebuild the key parts to the storage. The other specific is that the solutions that ultimately used for remediation, they don't work on day one, and it's because of policy differences, data differences, the way that backups have been managed. They're all almost always somewhat slightly different. So there's an engineering element that requires, and because of the data privacy piece, you have your developer engineers largely in the US, although we have them in the UK as well. But then to actually implement a working solution in 2 other continents can be extremely hard, because there's a process that has to be gone through to A, get it to work, and B, then prove and verify that it works and it's defensible before you get going. So that was a challenge, but we were somewhat lucky in this one that we were able to do the proof of concept in the US, perfect from their data center in use in the US, perfect the solution, and thankfully the systems were largely similar in the other 2 continents, so we were able to get it done and prove it working in the US, test it all out, and then move it to Europe and move it to the data in Asia. So that was a fairly major piece. But there's a development exercise there, and then the other implementations are or the other issues you have with something like a data domain is the bandwidth to actually move stuff out. As I talked about this in the last part 1 of the webinar, a small front door, small back door, this is the data in the house. You just can't do this quickly, and if there's situations like synthetic full backups that have been managed, it just compounds it, and it makes the data unusable without accessing the storage piece very, very rapidly. So this can't be done natively. It was a networker, original Legato networker environment with data domain, and you can't do it native. So our code had to be so we never actually used the data domain. We just took this, once we got the units powered up, we basically accessed the storage elements with our own software, with our own code, so that we catalog, find, verify, and filter accordingly to be able to access the mailboxes to keep, and then group them together, mass deduplication, extraction onto a encrypted hard drive, and that was ultimately the delivery. So that's basically the high-level view of the project.
Okay, yeah. A lot of steps for sure, and a lot of challenges. So obviously success happened, or we wouldn't be talking about it, but what did success look like in this project? So Brendan, obviously I think this slide really hits a lot of it. Anything particular you want to point out here, about kind of what the outcome was?
Oh, but the one thing that I did forget to mention was that this was post-COVID. So, and I think I mentioned this in the last time, we actually had to rent I think it was a Boeing 767 or a 737, and actually move one data center to another, set up a cage in Europe where we could have that data. So that was a challenge. But the success, it was largely on time. I think it was maybe just a little late, but actually on time. Largely on budget. And what meant is that all data domain environments were eliminated. All 3 third-party data center storage provider contracts ended. The biggest feature was that future risk was eliminated from potentially data held that ultimately could have been risk in the future. And then in terms of response to requests, a dramatically major, much improved, faster time to data for subsequent requests, legal requests. So it was a huge success.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like it, and quite an interesting project. So thanks, Brendan, for recapping the project and what we talked about in the first webinar. So now that we're all caught up, let's get into the topics for this webinar. And let's face it, it's hard to talk about anything these days without AI being a part of it. AI has become ubiquitous in our lives, especially after the explosion of Gen AI on the scene via ChatGPT and other AI models. It also creates some pretty cool graphics, as evidenced by the graphic on the right there, which, like all the others in the slide deck, were created by Microsoft Designer. But defining AI, much less understanding it, is difficult. If you ask 10 people on the street to define AI, you'd probably get 10 different definitions. So Dera, AI is a buzzword on everybody's minds these days, but coming up with a definition for AI that everybody can agree with seems to be elusive. So how would you define it foundationally to help bring us together all on the same page?
Doug, you're right. There isn't a single definition of AI, although many of the definitions share a lot of common characteristics. And I spend less time trying to define AI, right? It's a little bit like defining, like, what is the one definition of a meal, right? Or what is the one definition of exercise? The single definition is sort of less important than really understanding the constituent components of it. So it generally refers to the development of computer systems capable of performing tasks that we equate with human intelligence. Right. And this is where the definition can start to align with our tendency to anthropomorphize these computer systems. But some of the characteristics that we're typically referring to are things that appear to resemble reasoning, decision-making, problem-solving, understanding natural language. Sometimes people also throw learning into there. These are characteristics we normally associate with human intelligence. And when a computer system can be designed and programmed to replicate some of those activities, we refer to those activities generally as evidencing artificial intelligence. A lot of those characteristics are based on specific technologies, for example, machine learning, deep learning, and more recently, some of the technologies behind generative AI, like transformers.
Yeah, it definitely it encompasses a lot, and certainly in the era of ChatGPT and Claude and Gemini and other LLMs and Gen AI models, everybody seems to be acting as though AI is a new thing and that we're finally applying AI to legal and e-discovery processes and workflows. But what are the flavors of AI, and how did we get to this point?
Yeah, so I just, you're using my language. I refer to it as flavors of AI, not to trivialize it, but I'm going to bucket it into sort of two major categories. And, one of them is this generative AI. And this refers to models that can create original content. For example, text, images, videos, right? So we've seen some of these. The models, though, are really important, right? So some of them are diffusion models, transformers, autoencoders. So there's different technology that accomplishes this, but it's really about taking disparate elements and putting them together in a way that we, as humans, understand it as having meaning. For example, the wonderful diagram that you've created using some of these tools. But generative AI often happens in phases, right? So there's the training, and then there's often characteristics of like tuning or the application of RAG, which is a little more complicated, and then generation. The predictive models have actually been around for a long time, right? And I generally call them predictive models because that's fundamentally what the technology is doing. So if you've ever followed a little paranormal blue dot around from Google Maps, or if you've looked at, your Netflix and gone, oh, people who've watched this have also watched that, maybe I'll try it out. Or if you've ever said, hey, Alexa, tell me what what the weather is like outside, you're using an AI system that's based on one of these predictive type of models. So the earlier technologies were based on machine learning, and this involves training an algorithm to make predictions based on training data. A lot of the techniques are statistical, decision trees, linear regression, neural networks. Deep learning is I'm going to describe it a little bit as a more advanced form of machine learning, although anybody with the technical background will go, that's not entirely true, but it's sort of like understand it to be like a level deeper. They're deep neural networks, which are said to replicate the way that neurons function in the brain. Again, this anthropomorphism. And it's really well suited for analyzing very, very large sets of data and extracting information and making predictions without human involvement. So these are the ones that are said to learn from pattern recognitions and actuate or generate predictions without human intervention. So those have been around for some time.
Okay. So, with all that and with all the technology changing so rapidly and organizations faced with so many challenges to leverage AI effectively, efficiently, and ethically, what are some of the discussions you've had with clients regarding their considerations about when and how to apply AI?
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of the companies will come with an idea, and a lot of it is really focused on job cuts, right? So people are quite concerned, like, is this going to replace us? And so I try and ask people to take a step back, right? And not try and identify business use cases, which are involving taking humans out or simplifying things. All technology, whether it's AI or any type of technology, I mean, the purpose of it is to eliminate labor, right? That's the purpose of it. And it does so by amplifying a capability or accelerating a capability. So I ask people to try and identify use cases where you can lean into that acceleration of activity, speed to outcome, or amplifying, doing more with less. And often when you identify one of those, you'll discover that what you're actually doing is disintermediating something, right? Taking steps out of the process or taking a human out of the process. So that becomes something we might want to lean into, and then looking at where the risk shifts because you've fundamentally shifted the underlying process, right? So you can think through what that would mean with something like Uber or some of these other technologies that actually take something out in the middle and move it over. And then when a company can actually identify that business case, I ask them a couple questions, right? What data do you need to accomplish that business? And is the data ready to do that work? Because all AI projects are actually data projects. It's data plus model plus compute, you get to an AI project. And what I discover is things fall apart at two places. The business can't actually identify a good business case, and then we do a bit more work and it can. But then I find things often fall apart at the data level. They don't know what data they need, or if they know what data they need, they can't find it, or it's not ready. It's not properly cleaned up.
Yeah, which is a great segue to the next slide, but I'm going to bring in Adam first before we go there. So Adam, given your role as Director of Discovery Operations, what are some of the considerations about when and how to apply AI you've seen from a corporate perspective?
Well, yeah, and as Dara mentioned, we've been using AI and eDiscovery for the better part of a decade. So we have some well-established operating models and guidelines around the use of a lot of AI technology. I think the more interesting question is, where do we bring in some of these generative or new kind of AI technologies? And I think that's a tough one because not to get too far into our next slide, but a lot of the application of those technologies requires the underlying datascape to be in good shape. And it's like, AI is no different than many other things in technology where we say, garbage in, garbage out. If you have fundamentally, you feed the AI bad, confusing, misleading data, anything like that, the AI is not going to magically clean that up for you. It's going to make assumptions and give output based on the input. So I think the first consideration we make, and I think a lot of companies will make at a level of, should we turn AI loose on this task, is a fundamental risk assessment. what's the risk if the task goes completely off the rails? And then how stable and how qualitative is the data that sits at the root of whatever task we're trying to solve, whatever we're trying to remove the human out of, or automate the process. Is there a good bedrock foundation of data to help that process along? And if there's not, then the data cleanup and kind of the task definition and problem definition needs to come before that application of AI technology, which is not always easy in the current times of everybody slapping the now with AI label on their product and trying to figure out, okay, what does the AI do for me? And then that question is not as easy to answer. So that's where we really look at it from a corporate standpoint, not just in legal, but throughout an organization. Is our data in good enough shape where if we apply some of these AI models to it, we will get expected results? And that's the foundational question we have to answer before we consider turning some of these models loose on our internal data pools.
Yeah, absolutely. And couldn't agree more. The whole to slap something on it and call it AI. I think there's a term for that. I think it's called AI washing. And definitely we actually had a very notable example of a company that was claiming they were offering AI and really wasn't. So, so since we've been talking about the data, let's tie everything together and get to the role of data in the application of AI. So, Dara, in our prep session the other day, you said you've never generated for data remediation projects as you've done right now. So, what role do you think AI has played in that increased focus on data remediation?
Well, everybody's excited to do AI projects, and I've just told you the first three questions I ask are, what's the business case? Like, what's the use case you want to do? And then I say, what data are you going to point this AI to? And is the data ready for it? And that's usually where the stumbling blocks occur. And we have a lot of conversations like, oh yeah, actually, I'm very interested now that I've identified the use case and the business case for it. I'm very interested in doing that. But there's a cleanup that needs to happen. And this isn't actually that surprising, right? Anybody who's worked on an AI project before and either helped a company build an AI model or who has applied an AI model, right? Even if you're doing an eDiscovery, there's a certain amount of training you need to do, whether it's TAR or CAL, and it takes a little bit longer than you think. And yeah, the results are great, but that's a great example of the kind of data munging that needs to happen before you can implement AI. A lot of these tools are not sort of coming out of the box. It's a model and you need to do your own data munging. And people are really starting to understand that. And they're really also starting to understand that they really haven't done the work over decades to prepare their data estate for these technologies to roll over their data estate. And that's what I think is happening here. I think another difference also is with generative AI, you're now starting to point these tools against unstructured data. A lot of companies have had programs in place, whether it's master data management or data governance or data quality programs, to clean up data inside structured systems. And it's a little bit easier to do that. I'm not saying that it's not complicated. It's easier to clean up something that's already in tables and rows and columns than it is to clean up a lot of unstructured data. For example, stuff that's trapped in email or Word documents or SharePoint or Teams channels or you name it, and start to put some shape and structure around that. It's a totally different type of exercise than most companies have ever undertaken before.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and eDiscovery professionals know about unstructured data very well because that's pretty much most of what we deal with.
It's where we live, right?
Exactly.
So they are well positioned to start taking on this challenge, right? Very well positioned.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously clean data leads to better performance of AI models, but what other data factors about the data are important for successful AI results?
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about my top 5, right? And people will hear me talk about LAPS, right? A lot, LAAPS. And this is sort of what I mean. These are the top 5 things I hit. And if these top 5 things aren't there, like no point even proceeding. There are other things that you need to deal with once you do that. But one is lineage, right? Lineage. you got to know where the data came from and whether you have rights to it. For example, privacy rights, IP rights, contractual rights, all of that may impact whether or not you want to point the model to that data or not. You got to think about it. There could be crown jewels, highly sensitive data. So think about that. Alignment, right? A lot of people talk about training and testing data, but they don't think about the data they're going to point this AI to and whether there's alignment between the data that an organization has and the kind of data that the model has been trained on. If there's misalignment, that might be the wrong model, right? And wrong training set for your business case. You got to figure out alignment. Access, right? So are you creating new access and access control risks by pointing the data to that data set, particularly in an unstructured environment? What I mean by that is people generally have access control around the roles, right? And so if you haven't been permissioned to something, you can't see that content. But in some generative AI systems, when you start rolling it across an organizational corpus of data, it's training across the entire corpus and could feed back information that perhaps that user isn't supposed to see. So you've got to think through access and data protection impacts of having something roll over your data system. And then prepared, right? On predictive AI, as much as 80 or 85% of the time that's actually spent on a predictive AI model generation is actually on data preparation. Have you done that data preparation? Even Gen AI will improve with a type of munging, right? Whether it's fine tuning or incorporating retrieval augmented generation across that data corpus. You got to do something and not just point it, right? And then I refer to this often as stability or sometimes management. And Adam talked about this as well, a really key part of it. The data, you've got to make sure that the data that you're going to feed into the system will not change over time, meaning it continues to be aligned with the model, or right, that the model can be adapted if your input data changes. So there's got to be some sort of mechanism for monitoring to make sure that you're not getting data degradation or model degradation during the course of your use of these tools. There's key 5 things that I recommend people answer before starting a project.
I'm going to have to definitely remember that acronym. So how do the data considerations differ between predictive and generative AI, and what types of risks should organizations look out for?
Yeah, I think I've summarized it a little bit, is that often with predictive, you are really feeding in structured or semi-structured data, or there are sort of like known and defined processes for cleaning that up. I mean, the whole master data management and data governance is a really mature field, right? There are known techniques for doing that, and known decisions that organizations can take. With the unstructured data, there's not the same experience in cleaning it up and preparing it. Now, there are emerging techniques, as I said, through retrieval augmented generation or by fine-tuning the data, which are the 2 most common ones. But thinking through, are you going to add, enrich your data? Are you going to add tags? Are you going to implement different access control models? A lot of this involves reconfiguring the environment before you start rolling AI on top of it with unstructured data systems.
Makes sense. So Adam, you talked about the Legal Data Intelligence Initiative in the last webinar as a model to establish best practices to manage legal data and apply it to various use cases. So how does AI fit into that equation?
Very easily, actually, since, as the last bullet on the slide notes, AI projects are essentially data projects. We can equate those two. And the LDI models give people in the legal space, the IT security space, a model by which to deal with these large volumes of data, to do the data remediation that's necessary to get good outcomes when you start applying AI over it. I think, as Dera mentioned, companies are finding and organizations are finding that Copilot integration is one of the great drivers of data hygiene and access control hygiene, because you have, years, depending on when a particular organization, invested in the O365 kind of cloud storage model, just years of data sitting out there that people may or may not realize that when you say, I'm going to share this SharePoint site with anybody in my organization who has the link, well, you would naturally think, okay, that link is my access control. Well, Copilot doesn't respect the link. It just goes out and says, well, you can access this. I'll assume you had the link at some point. So I'm going to load all this data into my model and then, use it to answer questions or give output or whatever. So, just to bring that back home, the legal data intelligence model and project is really about, okay, assessing the current state of what data do you have, and then how do you take that data and either protect it in the case of, it was shared broadly and shouldn't have been, or even just how do you get rid of the data rot, which is the redundant, obsolete, or trivial data, because it's not necessary. And not only does that help you with AI, it also helps you just in the general kind of, area of legal risk. The more data you can defensively get rid of because you shouldn't have it anymore, it's unnecessary, the better position you're going to be in the eventuality that you get a subpoena or some sort of litigation. So that's, the LDI is not technology specific, it's technology agnostic, and the workflows work just as well with AI preparation and cleanup as they do with more traditional workflows.
Okay, great. Thanks, Adam. Now let's talk about the fun stuff and the real world application of AI. And of course, real world caused me to create that world graphic on the right, and it only took me generating 20 of them to get one that was acceptable. So there we go. So Dara, historically, we've had a structured way of considering AI for legal use cases. You talked about, essentially tying to predictive AI for things like eDiscovery review. So do you think Gen AI will result in a potential explosion of use cases? And if so, what types of new use cases do you see it being applied to?
Yeah, I think the risk that, so yes, I do. But the question is really, the timeline, right? If we think about it, the internet has transformed the way we practice law. It's just it happened by degrees then all at once. And I think that generative AI is going to be the same, right? It's fundamentally normal technology that's going to have isolated niche impacts probably pretty quickly, and then large scale impacts over the course of a generation. That's my prediction. It may not be 20 years, it may be 15, it may be 12, it may be 17, but that's what I see. So what I find very interesting is that when the predictive modeling came into eDiscovery, it was really pretty limited, the early eDiscovery TAR and CAL applications, and really didn't work with every single data set. And you had to select your cases with care. And when you did that, you could get some pretty good results. And it has materially improved over the past decade to the point that it can encompass a much wider range of characteristics. The algorithmics are better. We can do a lot more grouping and clustering and everything else like that, right? It's a pretty mature product. And I think the same transition will happen over the next decade with LLMs, because we're also going to spend that time cleaning up our data, right? The other major transformation is that you weren't getting POP3 email anymore. You were generally getting email out of a single system, whether it was Exchange or whether it was everything else. So the underlying technology around email transformed and also helped improve the quality of the training we could do on that data. Those two things will work in tandem. So everybody's rushing to have it summarize all kinds of documents or have it generate contracts. And I'm like, well, let's look at some, small use cases that it can actually do today. And where I've seen some of the most creative solutions that are making real impacts on legal teams are things like training junior lawyers in scenario-based or niche topics, right? Defining a single period of law, area of law, and then having the generative AI sort of generate questions that they can interact with defined materials and start to learn areas of law, and then go into the research to generate. So they, it's speed to actually knowing what's going on and doing that. I've also seen some great real world examples on helping more junior lawyers train on client interactions, like writing emails, helping them prepare to write emails, all of that kind of stuff, and generating some content. I've seen some really interesting potential use cases around witness preparation for examinations to reduce the amount of time that lawyers are spending doing that, right? Using that ability to generate questions against a defined set of materials, usually where the LLM has been fine-tuned on those materials. And I'm starting to see people play creatively with doing jury selection analysis and maybe defining some interesting questions based on publicly available materials about that potential jury pool. So things you wouldn't think about, highly defined areas. And I think that that's great. We also underestimate the ability of these tools to help clean up data, right? So one of the things that I always do is I take, network maps or IT maps, and I ask an LLM to summarize the relationships and the integrations and the APIs and make it into a chart. It saves me dozens and dozens of hours. And it's also made me an Excel whiz. Anybody who's worked with me knows my pivot tabling, some stuff like not so great, not so fast, prone to error. Now I just type it into Copilot and have the Copilot do all that Excel stuff for me, generate all the formulas for me. And so it's turning lawyers into Excel whizzes as well. Those are just some use cases that actually improve the ability of people to deliver legal services, even though it's not about the law per se. Right? So we need to think outside the box and not go straight to the end result, but get there incrementally.
Yeah, and I think we're just scratching the surface on the various ways we can use the technology. So you talked about using AI to help clean up the data. How can it actually increase the business value of that data?
Yeah, as companies really think about where it does is it helps companies really think about what data is in that unstructured environment and what's really useful in it, right? A lot of times we go to it thinking, what do we need to put on under legal hold? So we're approaching it from a compliance obligation, but we're not thinking about the potential value in there, right? Oh, it's a record of every PO to every client that we've sent, or our crown jewels are in there, or oh, how we come to decisions is in there. And getting people to pay attention, to treat it as the asset or the liability it is, recharacterize it. Oh, it's not just stored email, but actually this is where we keep this kind of data, allows for a recharacterization, is really important. So I'll give you an example of what I mean by recharacterization. As we go in and out of our office buildings that are subject to badge access, we just think about that as allowing us entry into the building. But in the hands of a different part of the business, that actually helps define, what you need for emergency planning. How many people are in the building and when do they go there, right? Capacity planning, like do we need to actually rent more space or decrease space, right? And also advertising. Advertising is starting to be interactive and understand when people are passing in front of intersections and they're increasing the price associated with that due to the increased visibility. So that kind of information can actually be recharacterized and add a huge amount of value, whether it's monetary or not, in a different context. So think about recharacterizing the use of that data.
Okay, great examples. So Adam, what potential use cases do you see for AI from a legal compliance and business intelligence standpoint? And how do you think Gen AI is changing the equation?
Yeah, so I mean, Dara hit on a lot of those. We use, and we're starting to use generative AI in legal in non-legal ways, right? Like there's the obvious, okay, I'm going to go out, I'm going to get a first draft of my, motion to compel, or I'm going to get a first draft of this complaint or sum up the EEOC letter I just received. That's fine. And the LLMs are certainly fine with dealing with that, especially the purpose-built ones. But where we also, I think, need to be cognizant of the potential for AI to help us out is in the actual business work that we often expect a lot of our legal departments to do. So that boils down to eDiscovery operations, legal operations. Can we use AI to more effectively manage our billing solutions and more effectively budget cases and use predictive modeling to say, well, the last 4 cases we got that were similar to this, here was the ultimate outcome. So can we use that to drive settlement decisions? Or at a minimum, drive settlement negotiations. If you kind of have some of that knowledge beforehand, it's a little bit like being able to see into the future when you're performing your contract or settlement negotiations. I think it's those non-traditional uses that will allow forward-looking and highly technical legal operations and legal departments to really excel, and to be, you know, kind of best in market or best in class. And I think the other thing that really drives this is using AI to help turn legal, especially in the corporate environment. I can't speak to you know, external firms, but in the corporate environment, legal is often seen as a cost center, or just, you know, where budget goes to die, because we're here and we'll defend the company when necessary, but it's not exactly a revenue generating function. And I think using some AI, using some models, taking the data that legal already has access to, whether it be regulatory data, compliance data, you know, all the contracts that our contracting group reviews on a you know, a daily basis for all your suppliers, goods not for resale, goods for resale, all those contracts, and say we can extract some really powerful business intelligence from that data. We already have it because we're already doing these things. And so one of the things that, you know, comes top of mind is, wouldn't it be nice to get some AI generated insight into one of the 10,000 supplier contracts we have and say, hey, you know what, if we held this group of suppliers to the payment terms or to the actual delivery schedule, we could be saving X amount of dollars, or we could defray X amount of cost, whatever it is. Taking that information back to the business and saying, hey, you know, we were analyzing our contracts. Have you seen this, or have you considered XYZ, whatever the insight is? And I think that takes legal from being a cost center to being a business partner and a value proposition for the company. And then I think the other areas are just, you know, as Dara mentioned, it's turning lawyers into Excel wizards, and it's turning eDiscovery professionals into even more technical heroes by writing PowerShell scripts for them, or writing code, or Python, or whatever. And it's taking that ability to say something that would have been perhaps a week of learning, digging out books, doing some research, going to the Microsoft Help library. I can go to Copilot, ChatGPT, whatever, and say, here's what I'm trying to accomplish. Shoot me out a script. And it may not be 100% correct, but it's going to be 95% of the way there. And that's good enough, because we can fiddle with it and get it the rest of the way. And so I think it's those kind of applications, the non-legal applications, that'll really drive AI forward in our legal departments.
Yeah, absolutely. Great examples. We could spend a whole hour talking about these use cases and the various things we could do. In fact, Brendan, in our prep call, you talked about a terrific application of AI to remediate legacy data in the voice logging system in NICE using OpenAI technology. So could you talk about that project you worked on and what happened?
Sure. You know, first I'd say it's great to listen to Adam and Dara that are full of new business dev kind of opportunities with the use of technology. You know, I was one of the people, I guess, over the years thinking what it's going to mean to our business, and I couldn't imagine what it might mean to our business. But it's become clear that it's really opportunity more than any, and really it's projects that were previously unachievable becoming more achievable. And as a result of the use of technology, making things faster, cheaper, you know, more defensible and precise. And so we're working on potential solutions. I say a potential solution, it's not a complete project yet. That exactly this, and that it's a nice voice logging system that's stored tens of millions of voice calls, and the system is set up in a way that you have particularly the backed up voice calls, a proprietary kind of file format .nml, which is like an encrypted compressed file format, and then you have some metadata in those files, but the important piece that puts it together, it's for managing call centers typically, within the server database. It's a SQL database that's backed up in the NICE, that's actually residing in a NICE server. That's not available, which basically means you've got 100 callers and 1 million calls. You've got the calls, but you can't match the callers. And these companies that use this kind of technology, compliance can be a major factor, where they have to keep access and be able to who made this call and what was that call at any given time. So if you can't match the callers, you have no system. And in this case, the callers can't be matched. What we've been doing is using OpenAI, we're using Spur, which is an application within OpenAI, and we're using that coupled with the metadata we're extracting from files to be able to piece together, do it, voice to text, and then piece together the core identification of the portion of metadata. So we're essentially using it to rebuild that connection between who was the caller and what was the channel and what was the date and what was, who were they called to, et cetera, et cetera. So we're actually using an AI application to be able to rebuild that. And it's way faster and way more cost effective than than it may have ultimately originally been done. So it's quite exciting to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really cool what we're able to do with the AI technology, and I mean, we continue to find more ways to use it. So let's get into the considerations. We'll have to go quickly here. We've got a couple of slides left. For bringing AI into the mix, and of course, at the top of the list are ethical and regulatory considerations. On the slide, we provided several important ethical guidance resources for legal professionals, as well as some AI and data privacy regulations. Just note it's not by any means a comprehensive list, and even if we try to provide one, it'd probably quickly become out of date anyway. In fact, one of the things as I was trying to list the states in the ethical, I tried to find the New York State Bar guidelines I covered last year when they were released, and they don't seem to be available anymore. So not just additions and changes, but maybe even removals. So with that backdrop, Dara, when applying AI models to your client's data, what are some of the key questions to ask regarding the data and how it's being used to ensure the process is performed ethically?
Yeah. So I think there's sort of two dimensions to ethical. One is just what I call almost like a moral framework. Like, are you adding AI to do something by removing humans out of the loop that you wouldn't have a human do, right? So you wouldn't have a human necessarily do certain types of surveillance or, remove certain attributes or characteristics from people. So why have a technology do it, right? So there's that type of thing. A lot of that behavior is sort of identified by the prohibited uses in the EU AI Act. So there's that dimension, right? But then it's also thinking about the impact of this kind of activity on human beings, and beyond just the creep factor, are you removing people's agency and from their ability to decide, right? Through the implementation of a dark pattern or a deceptive design, right? So there's some ethical issues there. But then the other dimension of ethical use is really, does it conform to not only regulations and requirements, but and contractual frameworks, and just doing all that background work on the data that Adam and I and Brendan have been talking about, making sure that you've got rights to do it, making sure it doesn't violate any contractual requirements, and that you've thought through a lot of the LASP elements that I talked about before.
Yeah, makes sense. So Adam, how does some of the regulations on this slide play into considerations from a corporate perspective when applying AI models to your organization's data?
I mean, the short answer is they all matter. The slightly longer answer is perhaps it depends on what industry you're in. Walgreens is in pharmaceuticals, which is highly regulated. So we have some additional considerations we have to take, based on the bodies that regulate us, both here in the United States and abroad. But I really think what it boils down to is understanding what data the AI is acting on, what the AI is trying to do or understand or generate from that data, and then what are the use cases for the AI output? Will it violate a privacy law? Will it, is it an unlawful surveillance technology that you're going to go and spy on all your employees or your customers or whatever? And even some technologies, some states like Illinois were particularly, has the BIPA, which is the Biometric Privacy Act. So having AI facial recognition or something like that is even more problematic because it dips into other areas of the law that are also highly regulated. So I think it has to be considered. And I think ultimately what it requires is a multidisciplinary kind of cross-functional team of privacy, compliance, legal folks to say, let's evaluate the technology, understand what it does, how it interacts with these regulations, and, make sure we're implementing it in a responsible way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and talking about not just the obvious regulatory considerations, Dara, in our prep call, you talked about it, provide an example of that, which is kind of referenced in that last bullet point. So can you give us kind of a sense of that example?
Yeah, so I think one of the things is that even for companies, organizations that may not consider themselves to be highly regulated, right? Sometimes AI and the data underlying AI can enable you to do stuff that takes you to an area approaching what might be regulated. So a great example of that is HIPAA regulates the treatment of e-health information for entities that are covered by that law. But now there's new technology that allows for the collection of data that is structurally very similar to what a healthcare provider would collect, but those are not covered entities under HIPAA, right? So it can be everything from ovulation cycles to heartbeats to temperatures. And this data is kind of like health data, but it's not covered by HIPAA. And so it gets into some gray zones. And an area that I find people bump up against a lot is the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Now, that's an act that definitely applies to, the credit reporting agencies. It also, overtly applies to organizations that collect information that affects credit. That could be banks, credit card companies, for example, and organizations that use that information to make decisions based on credit-like information. So it could be a landlord when making a decision whether or not to lease an apartment, depending on, your income and your credit rating, right? But so much data actually is behavioral or could stand in as a proxy for credit-like data, giving you an indication kind of what you could pay, but isn't information that would be collected by a credit agency or that you're sourcing from a credit agency. And so a lot of things like choosing a recommendation engine, this product over that product, whether that product is financed or not financed, bundles of products together, could start to push the envelope into areas that could be covered by legislation like the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And so in those areas, you may not be traditionally regulated by one of those acts or think yourself, but just tread carefully and undertake legal review. Ensure that you are getting legal review where you are treading close to something that is regulated, even if you haven't understood yourself to be regulated in that way before.
Yeah, absolutely. Quickly, some other considerations on the slide you see here. I'm going to try to breeze through these questions here. And Adam, obviously, when we're talking about AI, I feel like we should be singing the theme song to the good, the bad, and the ugly, because it's a bit of all of it. So I'm going to kind of try to, I guess, combine these questions a bit. What do you think AI adoption can do for corporate organizations like yours, and how can it change the game for eDiscovery and compliance? But then also, how can your organization be more proactive and regarding AI and other advanced technologies to minimize risk and avoid the bad and ugly of AI?
Yeah, so it's not about eliminating human labor, right? And that's what everyone's always concerned about. Oh, AI is coming for our jobs. It's not. There's still a lot of things that human reasoning can do that AI can't. And so I think the good side is just taking repetitive, I'll even say mundane, perhaps boring, routine tasks and shifting those to allowing an AI model or some sort of AI system to assist with doing those tasks, which really frees up your internal labor pool to do high value, high reasoning, more interesting sort of creative work. And so when you want to talk about how, what's the good in a compliance and legal department, well, if we automate the legal front door, right? We don't need to have people, monitor shared inboxes and assign out subpoenas and things like that. We can take that off the plate. Those people can actually do things, much higher value to the organization, which is actually respond to the subpoenas or do other work that has this higher value. But I think when we talk about risk mitigation, it's always important. I'm a big fan of the trust but verify method with AI. You have to validate your workflows and what you're doing. You have to test these workflows out and make sure that the models are behaving the way you think they are. That may require long periods of adoption, long pilot programs, a lot of working side by side, having people and the AI doing some of the same tasks, and do they agree with each other? And I think that's really critical. So just, the other part, the last part I'll say is really just use your common sense. There are some things that AI is good at and some things that it's not. And I think going into AI adoption saying this is the panacea, it will cure all of our ills, is the wrong approach. And that's how people get into trouble.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So what can corporate organizations like yours do to future-proof data governance strategies to enable AI applications?
Yeah, I think that question answers itself more or less. You future-proof by having good data hygiene and by starting that hygiene as early as possible. So if you keep up with data hygiene, you have good data governance practices, you enforce them throughout your organization, that is the foundation to then being AI enabled or to have AI enablement come into your company. The worst thing you can do is have poor data hygiene practices and then throw AI on top of it and, just watch the chaos unfold.
Yeah, absolutely. So Brendan, by the way, folks, we're almost done. Got a couple of more minutes to go here. Just get through a couple of quick questions here. So Brendan, hopefully after 2 webinars, I think we've made it clear that data quality is key to effective AI, but you've also discussed how AI can help increase value out of data that's not optimized. So what advice do you have for our audience on how far to go to clean up data to a point where AI can obtain value from it?
So I make the following observation, is that historically, corporations have tried to understand their data by good records and information management principles, the RIM principles, organize, classify, categorize at the start. And then 10 years later, we're starting to focus significantly on metadata. And the reason we're focusing significantly on metadata principally is because the cost to do data analytics on fully indexed and processed content data is not always proportional. It's not always a cost worth taking. I think the use of traditional AI, static, unstructured, and gov data, and AI, I think that might actually change stuff. Whereas we can start to make higher quality decisions on content. We've historically used metadata to try and make decisions in the past. So I think this model might actually just open up many projects that are not being achievable in that as a result of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So got to the question slide here. One final question. We don't have any questions from the audience, so I'll ask each of the 3 of you for a final takeaway on a recommendation for what organizations should start doing now to get their data house in order and how to maximize the value of applying AI to that data. Brendan, I'll start with you.
Attention schedules, and I think that's number one, and question and challenge it. It's arguably been a situation of they know this, from a massive unstructured legacy data. The question is whether or not the cost to find something is problematic. It may not be a problematic cost, so that swing. So it may be worth looking at retention schedules and thinking, is it worth me tackling the products because they can be done faster and at a lower cost than historically.
Yeah, very good. That's a great point. Dera, quickly, your recommendation.
Yeah, you know what? I always say there's no AI without IA. So just get organizational consensus that IA is important, right? And that it's going to be properly funded as a way of future-proofing the organization. Because I tell everybody, if you're not doing it, your competitors are. And by the time you figure it out, it will be too late to catch up, right? And then it just starts small, whether it's starting with retention schedules or if that seems overwhelming, just starting by a policy that, the email is not a system of record, or just actually implementing legal holds, like just knowing what's covered by your legal holds. Any small step is a step in the right direction.
Yep, couldn't agree more. Adam, your recommendation.
Yeah, I'll echo a little bit of what Dara just said, because that was my first thought too, is you have to, get your house in order, understand what data you're retaining, why, if it's a legal hold or something else. But I think the most important thing is to really build partnerships internally to the business. If you're in legal, you need to have a best friend in IT. And that may mean you have to buy them lunch once in a while, but that's fine. It's a perfectly reasonable price to pay to have someone where you can pick up the phone once in a while and say, hey, I have this data problem. And you may, the IT person will likely understand the architecture, the actual data architecture better than I would in legal. And so having those internal resources in place and familiar with kind of the whys and of data hygiene, they can help with the hows. And so they can come back and say, oh, sure, we can do this, we can do that. So I think ultimately make a friend in IT. That will make your life so much easier.
That's great advice. And I'll just add, like I always say, just set aside time to learn, 5 to 15 minutes a day reading, and one free webinar a month, like the one you just attended here, and you learn a lot very quickly. So I want to thank our panelists, Brendan, Dara, and Adam, for their great insights today. And I want to thank you all for attending today's webinar on the ACEDS webinar channel. And I'll turn it back over to you, Mike, to close this out.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you everyone for joining us today for a great presentation. Thank you, Dara. Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Adam. And thank you, eDiscovery Today and our friend Doug Austin for a fantastic presentation. Please, everyone, go to aceds.org for a complete list of upcoming webinars. Have a great day, everyone, and be kind to one another.